All right, let's finish up absolute monarchs in Europe. And by the end, I'm going to relate it to something that happened in St. Mary's County a long time ago. So we talked about Louis XIV of France being the epitome of an absolute monarch. I mean, the perfect example. What was going on in Central Europe at this time? Well, we talked before about the Luther and the Protestantisms, and that led to the 30-Year War. The 30-Year War was a really bloody war between the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a Habsburg of Austria, and the Lutheran princes. It was a devastating war that killed maybe 1/3 of Europe's population, but it was finally settled by the Peace of Westphalia. So let's go back. The Habsburgs are the royal family of Austria-Hungary. They controlled the Holy Roman Empire, and they were Catholic. The Peace of Westphalia ended the 30-Year War, and the 30-Year War pretty much ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which said German princes have a right to decide for themselves and their subjects what religion to follow in their state. So it pretty much said, if you want to be Lutheran, go ahead and be Lutheran. If you want to remain Catholic, remain Catholic. Maria Theresa was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. She was a Habsburg, and she would become queen. But her father was worried that being a woman, her neighbors would try to seize her land, so he created agreements with many of their neighbors. One such neighbor was a German state known as Prussia. Prussia, and that's going to be a key German state you're going to need to learn later on, because out of Prussia arises modern Germany. Anyway, the Hohenzollerns is the family that ruled Prussia. So the Habsburgs ruled Austria, the Hohenzollerns ruled Prussia. Frederick Wilhelm, or William, was the one that really became the King of Prussia. Previously, Prussia had like electors, and they had alliances with the Junkers, or what Junkers is how it's pronounced, but you see it down there as Junkers. Junkers are the nobility of Prussia. So the nobility, the Junkers, gave Frederick Wilhelm the right to be called king. In return, their sons would be enrolled in the Prussian military. So Frederick Wilhelm created really modern Prussia. His son Frederick II, boy, he was a disappointment to his old man. He wanted to learn and study, and he was into music. And one time he ran away from home with his best friend. Frederick had him brought back and had his best friend killed in front of him because he wanted to teach this kid discipline. He never thought that Frederick would amount to much, but when Frederick took over, he'd be known as the Great. He began Prussian expansion. In fact, he broke the agreement with Austria and took some of Maria Theresa's land, claiming that he never signed the agreement. That was his dad that promised to respect Austria's borders. One war that Frederick the Great got Prussia involved in is the 7 Years' War. Here in the United States, we call that the French and Indian War, where us and the British were fighting the French and the Indians in the 1750s. Well, at this time, man, that left Frederick and Prussia, who was actually on our side, but you wouldn't have known it, fighting both Austria and France. And he was getting his tail kicked, but in the end, he was on the winning side, and he greatly expanded Prussia's territory. Russia begins, well, they were dominated by the Mongols after the Mongols took over part of Russia until Moscow leads them from independence. Ivan IV is often known as Ivan the Terrible. Really, his name is more like Ivan the Awesome Power or Terrible Power. At first, he was a great czar or king. You could spell czar T-S-A-R. Really, it's usually spelled C-Z-A-R. Means Caesar. And he had trouble with the boyars. The boyars are the Russian nobles. Much like the Junkers are the Prussian nobles, the boyars are the Russian nobles. And he constantly fought to gain greater power over the nobles. In the end, after his loving wife died, her name was Anastasia Romanov, he kind of went a little crazy mad and killed a lot of the boyars. And one time his own son and heir, Dmitri, was with his new wife, and Ivan said something about the way she was dressed, and Dmitri protested, so Ivan struck him with his staff and accidentally killed his own son. So he had no heir. So the bottom line is, after some bad times, what's often referred to in Russia the time of troubles, because there was no real czar, the boyars got together and said, well, let's go back to Ivan's wife and we'll get a guy named Michael to be our czar. This led to the rise of the Romanovs. The Romanovs are the royal family that ruled Russia for over 300 years. So the Romanovs are to Russia what the Hohenzollerns are to Prussia, what the Habsburgs are to Austria, and really what the Bourbons are to France. The greatest Romanov was Peter the Great. Peter becomes czar really at a young age. He was a giant. Some said he was about 7 feet tall. I've seen anywhere from 6'8" to 6'10". He liked to drink and party. He wasn't overly religious. He was an epileptic and had a lot of seizures. But when he was a young man, Peter traveled the West, and he saw how backwards Russia was. And he totally changed Russia when he became czar. For instance, he had an arranged marriage with a woman from a good family. And he actually had a son by her, but then he banished her to a convent and married a poor woman named Catherine that he loved. And she was pretty good at taking care of his epileptic seizures. So he married for love. He made men shave their beards. You can see here, he doesn't have a beard. He changed the way they dressed. He put styles of dress on every wall in every town in Russia and say, this is the way you should be dressed. No long coats, no high boots, no beards. And similarly for women, he changed their dress more to the fashion of the West. And while the clothing wasn't nearly as comfortable, he allowed women to come to parties. Previously, women had really no social life. He ended the practice of, on a girl's wedding day, her father handed the groom a stick, kind of to symbolize keeping her in line. So, I mean, he did a lot, but he spent a lot of money and he had high taxes. One of the reasons is he was trying to give Russia a warm water port. And so he fought a lot of wars, and that cost money. And he did end up taking from Sweden a marshy area along the Baltic. There he would build his grand capital, St. Petersburg. He built it as his window to the west. And he himself loved sailing in ships. One day he took Catherine, his wife, out on the Baltic, and a storm hit, and everybody thought, oh, the Tsar's dead. But like the next day, they rolled back into St. Petersburg, and everybody was shocked that he could survive. So quite a different person, and definitely changed Russia. He forced them to be oriented more towards Western Europe, more away from Asia. So Peter the Great. What about England? Well, you know, we don't really include England as an absolute monarchy, but one man tried to make them such. His name was Charles I. And Charles, and there's a lot of stuff around here named after him. In fact, I think Charleston, South Carolina is named after him. So Charles, and maybe even St. Charles, I don't know. That's a good question. Charles County? Could be. So Charles wanted to be an absolute monarch, but England had a parliament, and parliament didn't want to give sole power to the king, specifically the power to tax. This led to the English Civil War, and the English Civil War was fought between the king and his supporters, known as Cavaliers, and Parliament, who was led by Oliver Cromwell. And they were known as the Roundheads because they had really bad haircuts that were kind of like bowl cuts. So the Cavaliers were the royalists. They supported royal power. And the Roundheads supported Parliament. They were led by Oliver Cromwell. So how did this affect St. Mary's County? Well, St. Mary's County was the capital of Maryland. And because they were Catholic and they feared the Roundheads, who were Puritans and didn't like Catholics, they supported the king. Bottom line is the king ended up losing, and Parliament took over under Cromwell, and the capital of Maryland would be eventually moved to Annapolis, which supported Parliament. So that's kind of why we're not the capital and why we're not as developed as Annapolis. Eventually, though, Cromwell dies, and now England doesn't have a leader. And Cromwell wasn't king. They called him Lord Protector. And so they decided, you know what we need to do is go back and get a king again. So they invited Charles's brother to return from France where he had fled. And he came back as Charles II. This is known as the Restoration, which basically means they restored the monarchy. But Charles II was kind of smart. He knew he was only king because Parliament restored him to king power. So he granted them certain rights. One such right is what we have today. It's called habeas corpus. It means produce the body. It basically means the king can't throw you in jail without saying, all right, this is what you're being accused of, and do we have enough evidence to hold you? So that's what habeas corpus is. We have that right here in America. Later on, the next king, James II, was a Catholic. And, well, he had Protestant daughters. And England, under Elizabeth I, had converted, and, well, really Henry VIII, but Henry's daughter Elizabeth, made Protestantism the official religion. We said that's why many of the Catholics fled to St. Mary's. So James was a Catholic, but he had Protestant daughters, so they're like, all right, we'll let him be king, because we know when he's gone, we're back to a Protestant ruler. But in his older age, James took a young Spanish princess as a wife, and she had a son, and sons supersede daughters. So England didn't want to see a continuation of Catholic monarchs, so they held what was called the Glorious Revolution. It was glorious because there wasn't a lot of bloodshed. In the end, James couldn't get a lot of support, so he decided to flee to France. And Parliament invited William and Mary, who were living in the Netherlands and who were Protestant, to come rule as co-regents. That's why the College of William and Mary of Virginia is named after them. So William and Mary would take over. They were Protestants. They would be co-regents, meaning co-rulers. William was smart enough to realize, I want to deal with foreign policy, because he didn't like France. And I'll let Parliament run the day-to-day affairs of England, which is what Parliament wanted anyway. So England would have a constitutional monarchy where, the king has to abide by the laws. They have a constitution that grants Parliament certain powers. And the cabinet really runs things. Now, the king appoints the cabinet, but he's supposed to appoint it from the party that wins the most votes in Parliament. So, for instance, today, if the Labour Party wins more votes, then the king appoints the Labour leader as the prime minister. And that's how England's government works. So when you look at history, you think, what does this have to do with us? Well, to me, a lot, really, especially St. Mary's County history, not just the place names, Charles, St. Mary's, things like that, Calvert, but also, just think how different St. Mary's would be if the King Charles I had won the English Civil War. Maybe we would be urban with good restaurants and lots of shops, but a lot more traffic and less rural. So that's pretty much the end of absolute monarchy. Know that England, though a monarchy, was not an absolutist. The other ones pretty much were. And that's all I have for that.